Right. All right. Welcome, friends and comrades. Welcome to Chris Cutrone of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Chris, how are you?
Good. How's it going, Daniel?
It's going good. Happy 2025.
Yeah. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. So folks may first and foremost be surprised to see Chris on my show. So that requires a bit of an explanation. I recently appeared on Sublation Media podcast Diet Soap with Doug Lane. And what ended up happening and what has been happening for a few years now is a sort of back and forth between Spencer Leonard, Chris Cutrone, and myself as a sort of independent socialist writer and thinker on the left, concerned with building a sort of space, a public space for debate, disagreement. So the first thing I want folks to understand about Chris being on my show is that it does not imply consensus on his part or my part,
right?
Because I think there has been a view, a general view, that debate is to be avoided with people deemed reactionary. Then, of course, the question is sort of the definition of reactionary. I think that Chris's work is provocative. He's no slouch when it comes to reading methods. He's trained at the University of Chicago under Moishe Postone. He has, taught, hundreds of young undergrads and grad students in Marxism. And Chris's imprint, his footprint on American Marxism is real, despite what people may think. And to that, for good and bad, right? And so, so today's conversation is a way for us to examine our differences. And so I welcome Chris to the platform, in part because I felt it was a bit repressive that we had this talking past each other. I'm not going to sort of name names regarding anything about my hesitation to engage with you, but I just want to reiterate that this is a comradely discussion, that we've decided not to have a third party moderator. So it is a discussion, but it's going to be centered around a critical interview that I'm going to pose questions to Chris, and he could pose questions to me. That's totally welcome. I want to start by laying out a few points regarding some of your recent provocative statements on Diet Soap, on Sublation, but perhaps elsewhere, which is that we need to set the Marxism down at this moment. What actually do you mean by that? And how is that not a kind of resignation politics, or a type of promotion of a sort of apolitical sort of position? So that's one question I have. And then I want to talk about a text in the history of Marxist literature in the 20th century that's important for both of us, but perhaps for different reasons, which is the text on the concept of the left by Kowalkowski.
Yeah.
But first, why don't you, take the liberty to explain what you mean as to why, now that we're facing a new Trump presidency and so on, why the left should put down Marxism?
Well, it's not putting down Marxism exactly. It's more putting it in our back pocket. That at a practical level, we may not lead with Marxism the way people have tried to do for the past century. And that takes too much for granted. So I think that we have to, in a sense, re-earn our Marxism in practice. Meaning Marxism today is unmotivated. It comes in precipitously, and disputes within Marxism are not really theoretical disputes between Marxists, but are really practical disputes over politics and strategy. I had a debate with Swoletariat moderating with Eamon Stephen, who had me on with Alex Grant, who's a former leader of a Trotskyist group in Canada. And, theory does imply strategy, and it's something that I want to get into with you today, the difference between a descriptive, a normative, and a critical account of things. And I don't think that we're in a position to assume the strategy of the past. certainly not the 20th century. And what that means is that we might have to go light on the theory or be somewhat reluctant to immediately invoke theoretical justifications for what we might want to do practically, politically.
Okay. Because when I heard you say this, and you've said it sort of repeatedly, Chris, I think, is known as somebody who because you begin with the wider platform or wider sort of premise that the left is dead,
Mm-hmm.
the implication of that is not to move to the right, but it is to resurrect the left.
Right.
And then the natural question, Chris, I think becomes, well, what agency or what subjectivity are we working on the project of resurrecting the left with? So if we look back at your debates with Mike McNair, for example, what did he say? I mean, he said, well, I can agree with the Platypus's criticism of the existing left as a social strata of kind of dejected middle class, fallout from the new left and things of that nature. But you seem to, in a curious way, put a huge strategic focus on activating students through the Platypus Affiliated Society. And so I want to learn more about that.
Or deactivating them, maybe.
Yeah, because there is a sense in which, Marxism has is sort of saturated, one could say, in the public discourse. But at the same time, especially when we look at literacy trend of young people, it seems to me that to advocate a kind of slowing down or putting on the brakes regarding Marxist theory, there still remains a kind of rational kernel of necessity within, any left-wing project to ground its foundation in Marxist texts. So that was my main worry. A second worry about this claim, I think, goes back to the other thing I wanted to raise with you, which is let's call it like sort of the effects of the Platypus sort of position on the existing left. This will tie into Kołakowski. Insofar as, as I was saying with Doug Lane, you had this debate with Benedict Cryptofash, where you said, well, in a certain way, and I want you to clarify this for us.
He was a post-left Marxist, or an anti-left.
He's a post-left Marxist, and he thinks that in a way that's even more critical than you, that the existing left is exactly as it appears in all of its kind of paternalism with the Democratic Party and so on and so forth.
Left wing of capitalism.
It's the left wing of capitalism, exactly. So why don't you start by sort of articulating your differences there and how, because this becomes the heart of a profound difficulty when it comes to building alliances, when it comes to propagating Marxist thought, I think. When dealing with you and with your wider tendency.
Okay,
please.
Okay, let me let's step back a couple of steps. So early on with the millennial left, because that's really what drew me back in, was my students, and there was an impulse towards left unity. And left unity understood as a kind of a Marxist unity, and putting aside the sectarianism inherited from really the 70s and 80s, the aftermath of the 60s New Left. Now, that took a variety of forms. The first form was the newly refounded Students for a Democratic Society, the new SDS, which immediately got into debates about how they should put aside ideological differences, and they really resisted the entryism of ideological sectarians into the new SDS, most prominently the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, a Maoist group that is prominent in various activist circles, and which continues. The new SDS is basically an FRSO front group now, the remainder of it. So a kind of recapitulation of what happened to the old SDS with Progressive Labor taking it over, and the new left moving on from that. So there is the question of what the basis for left unity or Marxist unity would be. Now, Platypus, these are my students at elite institutions. they're students from a higher class background than I am myself, and who have personal resources to be able to do things that I myself have not had. And I knew what I was dealing with. I knew that there were
That gives
limitations.
new meaning to the last Marxist that you call yourself. You're like the last working class academic. Nah, just kidding.
Well, by the way, one of
Maybe.
my professors, Kenneth Warren, one of my dissertation chair, who's a friend and colleague of Adolf Reed, who's an old mentor of mine, remarked to me that I was his last working class PhD student, likely.
Yeah, that is a truth. I just want to hold your thought. Just sorry for the digression. That is a truth that has to be disavowed or is disavowed. You know, you need a bit of psychoanalysis to understand like how the contemporary left and even liberal institutions cover this. You know, they fetishize that point. It's too much to bear, perhaps.
Oh yeah. So I knew what I was dealing with in terms of the limitations of what we could do. And I looked at what my students were asking from me, and also what resources were available, what the existing left, the dead left, was. And when I thought of the left being dead, I was thinking of my own teachers. I was thinking of Moishe Postone, Adolf Reed, certainly my old sectarian comrades in the Spartacist League, that they really were not going to do it. They were not going to be there for this new generation of students. They were not going to provide them with what they needed, the leadership that they needed, or even the education that they needed. And that's really the issue. The issue is that the left that exists is dead in two different respects. It's dead as a practical force, as a practical political force. It has no independent practical political force of its own. But also it's dead in a more deadly and deadening way, which is as a source of miseducation. So while I learned a great deal from my teachers, from the Trotskyists, from Moishe Postone, from Adolf Reed, really from Adolf Reed a great deal, I also recognized that I had to read them against the grain, that they also were educating me in their own defeatism. They were educating me in their own resignation. And that, again, they were not going to be there for the new generation of students coming up trying to refound the left. And also, I thought, with greater possibilities, with greater potential than my generation had had. I think Gen X, living under the shadow of the 60s, new left, we didn't have the opportunity that the millennial left really presented, not only as a generational cohort, but as a historical moment. You know, there was not the kind of crisis that we've seen with the war on terror, the Great Recession, etc., now playing out in capitalist politics via Trump, etc. So I looked at what I had to work with, and it was very much modeled on like Marxist graduate school. So what did we do? We had a reading group, and then we held panel discussions, and we conducted interviews, and we published a newsletter basically of our activities, the Platypus Review. It was very student-oriented activity. And what we could do is deal with the left that existed in its essence, meaning what does the left do? It miseducates people. It educates people, it miseducates people. And it's hard to separate the education from the miseducation. You know, you mentioned Spencer Leonard. There's a bunch of us who were students of Moishe Postone, Spencer, Atiya Khan, Sunit Singh, James Vaughan. There were a bunch of us. And we looked at the other students of Moishe Postone, and we were like, they're not getting it. They're not getting what we're getting out of Moishe. We used to joke that we were the left Postonians as opposed to the right Postonians, meaning the sort of academic Postonians were the right Postonians and we were the left Postonians. And again, tongue in cheek. And we just thought, okay, why are we getting more out of Moishe than his other students? Because we're actually pushing him and reading him against the grain of his own impulses. And that was also true for me back in the day when I was a student of Adolf Reed and I met his other students, and I was like, huh, they're not really interested in Reed's Marxism, actually. It's very superficial, the degree to which they're picking up on the Marxism, and they're not really interested in the deep background and in his actual Marxist commitments. So knowing that, knowing what I was dealing with students, petty bourgeois intellectuals, would-be petty bourgeois radicals, radical intelligentsia, the left, in the pejorative sense, leftists, radical radlibs, right, who cover their radlibism with a Marxist veneer, a kind of pseudo-radicalism, a pseudo-Marxism, to justify their radical liberalism, their discontent as Democratic Party progressive type people. I knew that all my students were basically that. And that's what Moishe's students were, and that's what Adolf Reed's students were, and it didn't matter, like the esoteric depth Marxism of Reed and Postone didn't matter, because at the end of the day, their thought was assimilated to a kind of progressive liberalism, a progressive capitalist politics. So I knew what I was dealing with, and I knew how I had to deal with it. And my attitude towards the left, like, we were reading people, contemporary leftists, we were going to protest demos, we were paying attention to what was going on in the millennial moment. And we thought, okay, let's bring these people together for panel discussions, interview them, invite them to write for the Platypus Review, see what we can get out of them in the sense of getting them at their best, meaning can they sort of speak against their own resignation? Can they kind of transcend their own usual comportment inherited from the past? And could we learn symptomatically from them? And this is something that we'll talk about if we get to Nietzsche, what it means to learn from something symptomatically. It's very peculiar, by the way. I'll just mention, because you did talk about like the boycott, which hasn't stopped Platypus at all. It's kind of insanely foolish on the part of the people. But the boycott letter that was written and published back in 2013 was by a kind of disgruntled Occupy Wall Street guy who since left the left, became a Christian fundamentalist and dropped the left entirely. And he wrote into the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain's Weekly Worker, boycott the host. And it's like, well, but why would you boycott the host? So we also noticed something, which is that all the left tendencies are present at these demos, and kids are reading the papers that they're buying from these people, but they don't speak to each other. They pretend that the others don't exist. Right, so they boycott each other, the left boycotts each other, and we were going to break that boycott in hosting the conversation on the left, getting people who normally don't dialogue publicly to do so as a learning experience for a new generation of people. And then the idea was, well, Platypus must be up to no good in doing that, because of course all the various tendencies who boycott each other think that our inviting the other tendency means that we are supporting that other tendency against them. So it's a lot of work.
Can I jump in? Can I jump in on this?
Okay. Yeah.
So that, first off, I have two things to say regarding the 2013 boycott against Platypus. One is, well, first I want to talk about how I understand its rationale. I didn't know about the originator of it, but what I understand its rationale is that slightly different than what you're saying, which is what you're saying is that, well, there's a kind of sectarian history of the left, and people were intimidated by Platypus trying to sort of reveal the hollowness of those differences, which are petty, ultimately.
Right.
But in addition to that, Chris, we should be honest, there was also the issue, which was that you also presented a type of strategy, an internal strategy, and please tell me if I'm wrong, which suggested that the death of the left also, and this is something that I've struggled with you guys, and I think it's why some sort of good faith actors have a hesitation with Platypus, that you guys have a strategy actually to destroy the existing left. So it's not merely that these are petty bourgeois thinkers that can't accept their resignation or that the left is dead. It is also a strategy of some type of domination over them. And that, putting aside the curious case of how that may or may not resemble a left Nietzscheanism, but also, let me just ask you, to what extent is that true? Right? In other words, did you have, or have you ever had, and here I sound like an inquisitorial figure, I don't mean to.
Okay.
in intention to sort of destroy leftist intellectuals or destroy leftist publications or something like that? Because
No. I mean, first of all, saying that the left is dead, it just is dead, meaning you can't kill something that's dead. Second of all, we really did want to get the best out of people as ghosts of the past, because that's what the other, the left academia and left sectarian organizations, they are echoes, they are haunting ghosts from the past, meaning they are channeling the memory of something historical, but they themselves are not actually keeping it alive. They're keeping alive a kind of image of something. So you can't kill something that's already dead, first of all. Second of all, of course, we didn't want to stop anything that was actually going on, other than in the way that it already was running out of steam. So here, like left Nietzscheanism. If something's falling, give it a push. Now that sounds like a cruel, sadistic, whatever, right? Like, no, right? If something is falling already, give it a push, not because you're making it fall, but because you should be a subject of that process and not an object of it. In other words, if only the illusion of participating in something that's happening anyway. But also in that illusion of participating in something that's happening anyway, namely the passing of the new left generation. I also saw that when Platypus started in 2006. I thought, okay, the teachers of the left, academic leftists and sectarian leftists, are survivors of the 60s. They're not going to be with us forever. We have to get what we can out of them before they fully disappear. We have to get their living thought, if you will, before they literally die, and in a way that you can't get from their writing, because their writing is already conditioned by this resignation that I mentioned. They had already given up in the 80s. They all have given up. Again, Moish, Adolf, the Spartacist League, the rest of the FRSO, they've all given up. At a deep level, they gave up a long time ago. And if you read their considered deliberate publications, you're never going to get anything but that resignation, actually, as the subtext. So you have to engage them in real life. You have to actually push them. You have to get their voices to crack the way an opera singer voice reaches its limit, in order to show, okay, this is the history we have to get out from under. We have to overcome this history, and it has to be an authentic overcoming. Like, you can't just ignore it. Like, a lot of people on the left, I mean, certainly, Daniel, you must know this. A lot of people are like, ignore the sectarian left. They're just a bunch of kooks. They're just cults. And it's like, no, there's a residue of actual historical memory there. Right?
exactly, and that is actually one challenge that I have with your proposal. And going back to the Kolakowski sort of prophetic intervention, which is a very interesting intervention in some sense. It comes about, and correct me if I'm wrong, at a moment in Polish communist history in which this sort of Stalinist bureaucratic degeneration takes hold, and the true kernel of Marxism is forced to kind of go underground in a certain way. And Kolakowski asks a sort of provocative question in that context, which is, how do you preserve the left in the face of a kind of reactionary overcoming or absorption of it, in this case by Stalinism? And he says,
when it was loosening up, though, he wrote that after the Khrushchev speech during the liberalization in Poland and Hungary,
okay,
which ultimately was suppressed. But
right. Well, I mean,
clearly
it's also interesting to understand Lukacs' History and Class Consciousness as an interesting text, precisely because it too was written from the perspective of a Marxist intellectual, from the standpoint of a renegade communist party that was actually formally outlawed in his context of Hungary at the time.
Oh yeah.
Right. So it's very interesting to me that, and this is part of the reason why I think it's worthwhile to tether with folks like you, who are intentionally putting yourself at the margins of the mainstream left. I myself am critical of the mainstream left. I don't think that it would make any a very poor dialectical reasoning to exist on today's left and have this kind of reflexive idea of the left, where like we say like, oh yeah, DEI is completely compatible with the left, and like people that accuse Kamala Harris of being a communist are like, you know, this kind of
Right.
California ideology, you know,
Yeah.
that kind of, right?
Mhm.
That's kind of like, you know, that is a kind of nihilism in some sense, is non-thinking. Now,
Mhm.
the question, I think, Chris, is how far are you willing to go? And so this takes us, I'll give you an example as a case study.
Uh-huh.
You recently criticized the Gerald Horne, who appeared on my program,
Right.
as representing a theoretical position which was anathema to Marxism.
Uh-huh.
And I thought to myself, well, does Gerald Horne profess Marxism himself, irrespective of how he sees the emancipatory tradition of the bourgeois revolutions?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Because that's a theoretical debate. And I would say this, I would say that's an example, Chris, of you taking it too far, precisely because Gerald Horne would be, given his gravitas, his status within the Black intellectual community, within the American left in general, he is somebody that I would want to make a strategic alliance and solidarity with for those reasons. But also, let me give you another reason why I would. When I questioned his theory regarding fascism, and I said, well, it's actually better, I think, to be defined as Bonapartism. You know what he said? He said,
Mhm.
actually, oh, no, actually, I would entertain your view. In
Mhm.
other words, my mind is not made up. Okay.
Hmm.
In other words, there's a discursive process, which,
Oh,
well, let's say maybe a socialist
sure.
party could
Sure.
house debates with Marxist intellectuals
Sure.
that would allow that flexibility of a movement, of a kind of Platonic metanoia, of changing your mind,
Oh, for
right?
sure.
Right?
I don't
So,
wanna write anyone out of the left. And look, there are two things that we could say. There's theory and there's practice. We could put it that way. And again, I don't think that Gerald Horne is participating in a practical movement for rebuilding a revolutionary socialist politics in the United States. I think that he's engaged in miseducating people, most egregiously with the 1619 Project. And I think that you got him to confess that he's not a Marxist, meaning he dismissed the idea that Marxists see capitalism as the road to socialism. And he said, "Well, but what about all the victims? Right? What about," and he even brought in some other things like the unpaid sector is the more important sector because the paid sector are class collaborationist. All of that is very anti-Marxist. Now, that doesn't mean that if he wants to participate in rebuilding a socialist movement, he's welcome to do so. But that's not the role that he's playing. He's an academic Marxist, and he got on board with the 1619 Project. And I'd be remiss if I didn't just say, you know, Adolf, you can ask him yourself, would just say this Gerald Horne type character, like Robin D.G. Kelly and others, these are minstrels for the white left. And Adolf says, unfortunately, there is such a thing as the white left, and it's bad.
so I would just push back, and we can move on from this. I just want to say a final point, and you can then respond on Horne. Okay, what I found most interesting
He
about it.
defends Nicole Hannah Jones.
So that was actually what I was going to
He
say, which is
does.
my understanding is that there's a split within 1619, and that Horne represents the left view of it. Okay, on the one hand. On the other hand, I don't want to treat the radicalization of like Black Americans, and especially Black working class Americans, and how they see and conceptualize their history as somehow to be a policeman of that, right?
Look, it's not their history, Daniel. It's our history. Black history is American history. It's our history. And it belongs to not only Americans, but to the world. It's not their history. That's the first mistake. And Gerald Horne actually does presume that it's their history. It's not.
Okay, so I think that is something we can table for the purpose of getting through our different questions. We can just leave that as a point of contrast. Moving along, Chris, if I might, let's
Did you
move
see
to.
he had an interview with Brianna Joy Gray?
Mhm, mhm.
And he really defended the Democratic Party in certain respects. He also attacked them. He said, we, black people, are being blamed for Trump's victory by the Democrats. But then he also defended Kamala Harris.
I'll have to look at that. Yeah, I
And
certainly don't
against
share
her
that view.
criticisms, against Brianna Joy Gray's criticisms. So
Yeah.
it's the dual audience problem.
Well, it's also reflective of a scholarship which I think is setting a new paradigm for a moment in American history, which we on the Marxist left cannot deny, which goes back to...
Why not call it a bourgeois fad the way Lenin would?
I'll tell you why I wouldn't call it that, because it would alienate the constituency from which his readership hails. And it would also shut down what I talked about before, which is the possible metanoia of him engaging in the project of building socialism.
Call it that. Like, if he's going to call...
Do you think he's going to come to our socialist meetup if I call him that, if I refer to his scholarship that way? No way, he would.
If he's serious, then he's going to fight.
See, this goes back to the strategy of this implicit left Nietzscheanism, which I...
No, I'm not saying fight like a cage match. I'm saying fight like uphold his position. It depends on what we agree on and what we disagree on.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, if we agree on a working class-based revolutionary socialist politics,
mm-hmm.
then it makes all the other disagreements secondary. And we're free to have them, but it's secondary.
Right. Okay. I would want a more moderated position, but I would share the centrality of the working class as you articulated it just there. This is very useful because it dovetails into my next topic for discussion, which is Bonapartism, the state, and imperialism as a general horizon of conversation, Chris. And let us take it maybe from this vantage point. As a left-wing Postonian yourself, I am no master of Postone's work, although I have benefited from lots of it. I like, say, Deleuze, or like Foucault, or even like Nietzsche. Often it's the children of the thinker that become the problem, not the thinker themselves, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's always the case, right?
Yeah.
And be careful about who you give birth to, right?
Absolutely. Moise didn't give birth to me.
Okay, fair enough. Well,
he always said, what's good about Chris is also the problem. He thinks for himself.
well, now, okay, fine. So I was going to frame I was going to frame your general views on anti-imperialism as largely influenced by Postone, but I think it's probably bigger than just Postone.
It is.
Okay. So Postone's view on anti-imperialism, as he saw it, was that what is happening is a sort of degradation and a regression.
Yeah.
Right. That is both practical and theoretical on the left, which revolves around a complete misplacement or maybe even displacement regarding the insights of Marx into fetishism, and that imperialism ends up becoming almost like this blind, almost like the theory of Oedipus.
Fetish form.
Yeah, it's like a blind acting out. And that, I think, kind of dovetails with some of your wider criticisms of the left as kind of like an infantile form of politics, maybe. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could first articulate that, because it's here.
Yeah.
It's here in this point that I worry that you fall into a type of, maybe unbeknownst to yourself, right-wing Bonapartist position, because I've even heard you on Sublation, have an uncritical view of, say, the executive branch, right? I'm putting aside any support you may have had for Trump in 2016, right? But I think the two are related. I think the two are related, right?
Maybe
they are. First, can you just kind of lay out your view on your wider criticism of the anti-imperialist left? I know it takes many different forms.
No, it's this is a good point. So, I appreciated Moishe's article, History and Helplessness, published in 2006, written in 2005. It's one of the first things that I had my students read. And it's something that Moish wrote under the influence of his students, namely me and Spencer and others. So it did represent our dialogue around the anti-war movement during the War on Terror. And figures such as Christopher Hitchens and the old ISO, their presence, they came to heckle Christopher Hitchens once on a panel discussion that Moish had with Christopher Hitchens and Lauren Berlant. And, I appreciated his article. At the same time, I had my criticisms of it, which also affected it, right? So he circulated a pre-publication draft, and we had our criticisms. We weren't sure about his invocation of Hannah Arendt against Fanon. That might have overstated things. Ultimately, it's fine because it's really more about Sartre than it is about Fanon. And Sartre's own sort of minstrelization of Fanon, which we can't ignore. So I would say that as far as this might be the way that I could enter into the descriptive versus the normative versus the critical, and the infantilism and the psychology of it all. To say that something is the case is not to say it should be the case. Right? But I think that there are thought taboos. I think that there are taboos on speech. There is censorship where you can't say that. Right? Because if you say it, then you're kind of making it so.
So, for example, like you cannot say that that we don't live in multipolarity and America is the primary hegemon. You can't say that on the left because anti-imperialists want to present the fantasy that there's a growing block of resistance to the U.S. hegemony, and your position is no, children, right. Let's live in reality. Right. America has dominated the scene, etc., etc. Is that right. An example?
That's an example. Well, but also, Hamas is not just the current form of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, but they're a right-wing Islamist movement that has a particular history. So I'll just anecdotally invoke Moish, because he was very bitter about the ISO, the Cliffites, the SWP in the UK. And that's the milieu that really dominated the early millennial left. It's what dominates verso and historical materialism, that sensibility. And he said, the opportunism of these guys would make the old Stalinists blush. So they used to chant at their conferences, "We are all Hamas, we are all Hezbollah." And it's like, well, okay, so the Stalinists' opportunism, the Soviet Union, the East Bloc, their opportunism was in supporting Arab nationalism. But there's a difference in terms of opportunistically siding with and trying to manipulate Arab nationalism, and these sort of very tiny sects and very superficial intellectual currents who show solidarity with Islamists. Now, at the same time, I'm aware of the fact that Islamism doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of the failure of Arab nationalism. It comes out of the failure of Stalinism, in fact. But that doesn't justify it. In other words, we still inherit a kind of Stalinist worshipping of the accomplished fact. So we just say, okay, well, Hamas is doing what it's doing, and so that must in some way represent the Palestinian people, and therefore we are obligated in our opposition to Zionism and imperialism to support them. And it's like, well, wait a second. There's a whole history behind this. There's a history of failure and defeat of an actual Arab, Middle Eastern, and global left that is represented by the predominance of Hamas and Hezbollah as forces in the Middle East. And especially now, when they're running out of steam. In other words, I see the whole October 7th attack as a desperate attempt to do something because before they pass into oblivion. I saw it as like, I know what it's like now. I'm in my 50s. You're getting old and you have some young people and you realize these young people are not going to carry on the fight that I've been waging. And so let's make one last bid at relevance, a suicide attack. And it doesn't matter how many fellow Palestinians we take down with us. I'm sorry, we have to be able to say, look, this is just not the way forward. This is despair. This is hopelessness, actually. And it might hurt. You know, I was just teaching Freud. Something can be painful and nonetheless be true. Now, when I say that, it's not like I'm celebrating it. It's not like I'm happy about it. I'm not. I'm not at all happy about it. But we do have to not kid ourselves about what's really happening. And, you know, for
Well,
instance, I knew that Israel would win the war. How could they not?
mhm.
You know, but instead the left has to say, I went to the student encampments here in Chicago, and they said, this is the end of Israel. And I was like, no, it's the end of Hamas. What are you talking about? It's not the end of Israel, it's the end of Hamas. They were like, oh no, Israel's going down. And I'm like, well, at what time scale? Maybe in 50 years, but not now. What's going down now is Hamas. And not
So
because I celebrate it or like it, but because it is. It's not a
so the
normative statement.
so I okay, a couple of things, if I may. Number one, this sort of takes us back to the Horne question regarding what I want to call like the sort of process of radicalization or consciousness in our kind of liberal society, right? And the
These
truth,
kids are just going to be Democrats in a few
well,
years.
hold on, no, hold on, because like there's a difference between laying out this kind of strong, sober realism as you have articulated it. But there's two problems with it. One, it seems to me as divorced from any kind of moral solidarity with the oppressed. In other words, what I worry about is that through your criticism of hegemonic liberalism,
Mm-hmm.
your Marxism has forgotten about the reality, which Marx and Engels were intimately aware of and centered in their own practice of, and this is something Lo Cerdo has helped me with, and that will probably frustrate you, but let me articulate it, which is that, yeah, Marxists stand with oppressed people, and oppression has a multiplicity of forms that it takes. And imperialism is a form of oppression within the global South that militates Western core region
You
young
know,
people. Okay, now let me
when
finish.
people,
And
okay,
so as such, okay, if we remove ourselves from that arena of those demos, of those protests, of that energy, right,
but I didn't.
of that
I was there.
desire for a more just world,
Mm-hmm.
right, we're moving against almost the forces of history in some sense.
Hold on.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's see. Now, look, Gabriel Rockhill, Domenico Lacerdo, they will tell you, and you have to listen to them. The primary contradiction is no longer labor and capital, but it's imperialism. It's not Marxism. That's not Marxism. That's radical liberalism. That's petty bourgeois democracy. That's nationalism. That's all sorts of things. Solidarity with the oppressed doesn't mean solidarity with Hamas, nor with the PLO, nor with the left that's there, the PFLP, that decides that it wants to be in a popular front with either the old PLO or now with Hamas. And after Hamas, maybe they will decide that they're in a front with Islamic Jihad. That's not solidarity with the oppressed.
Well, it is, though, in the sense that when I had Mohammed Suleiman, who's born in Gaza and graduated from the Islamic University of Gaza, Rafat Al-Arir was his mentor. When he said, "I myself grew up in Gaza,
Mm-hmm.
critical of Hamas," he said he was taking exams
Mm-hmm.
when they had Qatar money coming in, and
Yeah.
there were Palestinians fighting each other
Together. Yeah. Of course.
before Hamas took power.
Yeah.
And he was always very critical of them ideologically. They started
Right.
off as a right wing Islamist charity, and they grew into something much different. Because of the degradation and the oppression that the Palestinians have faced, the consensus in civil society has been to support Hamas. Of course, that's unfortunate, but that is still the consensus. Okay.
Consensus or plurality or majority? Like, what are we talking about? Consensus. You know
What I
that
mean
there are
by
people.
what I mean by consensus is that, yeah, there is a history of a coercive rise of Hamas, which was twofold. One, aided by Israel, as you know, but
Sure.
two, uh, based on their own sort of, backward ideology and to some degree. But those two forces that brought them into power have now reached a different level of reality in which, based on the crisis of genocide facing the people, they have emerged as a force that is the only force capable of waging. Otherwise, it would just be lay down and be eliminated. So
well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, look, again, I don't, I disagree with my label mate, Norman Finkelstein. I don't think that October 7th was a spontaneous rising of the Gazan people. I do not. I think it was a planned strategic action by an organization. And it was not, they didn't hold a referendum with the people of Gaza before they took the action. They did not. And also, we should pay attention to the fact that Islamic Jihad and Hamas went on the offensive. The PFLP, which is in a united front with them, did not. They didn't join them. So they are joining them in fighting off the Israelis who have invaded Gaza, but they didn't join Islamic Jihad and Hamas in attacking Israel. Okay? It's not a spontaneous rising. It's political organizations with strategies and tactics. It's a deliberate thing. It's not just the cry of the oppressed. It's not.
I think we will disagree on that. And moreover, I would say that a better approach would not be to negate at a theoretical level.
But the PFLP didn't join the attack, and there's a reason why. Because they didn't sign on for that. They didn't sign on for mass murder of civilians.
Okay, well, my contention would be that the status of the Gazan, right, the calorie control.
There is no Gazan. These are mystifications. There's no Palestinian. There's no Israeli. These are nationalist terms. This is ideology. This is pure mystification.
Since 2006, the blockade and the oppression that has been imposed upon Gazan way of life led to a collapse. I mean, many scholars have pointed to this inevitability.
There were still wealthy people in Gaza living comfortably. You know that. There were still businesses.
Yeah. I think that, again, this will represent a point of a profound difference between us. But let me say one thing. Where I might...
that's true.
Well, I do know that there is levels of education in Gaza that are quite high per capita, and there are some aspects like that. But I also know that their mobility...
Oh, sure. I'm not saying... Look, I'm not denying the oppressive situation. What I'm saying is it didn't impact everyone equally. It did not.
Fair enough. But what I would like to see after October 7th became a reality, which retroactively, out of a sheer sort of out of the brutality of the onslaught of the Israelis onto the Gazan population, it became a necessity to not lay down and die, but to fight.
Sure.
What I would like to see socialists in the West, in the United States, learn from this multiplicity of oppression, that the struggle of the working class has a certain solidarity with that struggle. And I think that is something that imperialism affords us at the level also of consciousness, but also at an experiential level. I'll just use my brother as an example, and myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry to tell you, but I first became convinced of the left, being raised in a family that is very right-wing and working class and all of that, doing bricklaying and landscaping and construction. No real college education from my parents. It was the war in Iraq. Was the war in Iraq, right?
Yep.
But then once I then read Marx, right, and then I saw my labor condition in that, so the combination of those two things was like a powder keg, right? So I would hate to foreclose anti-imperialist struggle as somehow irrelevant.
No, I'm not. It's not that. It's not about that. No. Look, it's not about that. It's about how we do it. It's not whether, it's how. And I think that, again, the miseducation. So I remember Iraq veterans against the war. And I remember, they would speak at events and at demonstrations, and they would say, if I were an Iraqi, I would also be fighting against the Americans. And I thought, you might think that. You might think that you're watching, like, I don't know, Mel Gibson's The Patriot or something. But in reality, in Iraq, it's divided Shia, Sunni, Kurd, Arab. There's all sorts of forces at work. There was an Iraqi left. There was the Iraqi Communist Party. There was the Worker Communist Party of Iraq. There were labor unions that those leftist parties were associated with, and they did not join the military insurgency against the American occupation because they didn't think that was the right strategy. And because they knew that to do so would immediately mean that you're going to be a pawn in larger sectarian conflicts between the Shia and the Sunni, and with respect to the Kurdish Arab division as well. So they didn't want to fall in with that because they're organizations that are Sunni and Shia and Kurdish and Arab. So they said, people have a right to resist occupation, but politically, we're making the choice. This is not the strategy. Okay. Now, where's that voice? That's gone, because instead it's like, which side are you on, comrade? Are you on the side of the Iraqi resistance? But there is no Iraqi resistance. These are organizations that have their own agenda and that would play the American occupation off their opponents. The reality of the situation is that these were people who were jockeying for power and who were utilizing the American occupation to achieve their own aims, in fact. So we shouldn't be naive. And if we're going to be serious about a real socialist movement that can actually take power in the United States, elementary political strategy has to be admitted. You can't stay at the level of morality and psychology. You can't stay at the level of outrage.
Sure.
You can't. That's not serious.
Sure. Well, you sure, but you can.
You see, Domenico Lacerdo and Gabriel Rockhill have made a considered decision to say the primary contradiction is imperialism. What it expresses is they don't think there's any hope for a socialist movement in the United States. That's what it means.
Well, I mean, I think that's tied to a wider theory of labor aristocracy theory, which I don't agree with myself.
Right.
Because I'm an independent socialist thinker. At the same time,
we know that workers are oppressed in the United States. We know it.
Of course they are.
In other words, being from a working class background, you can't deny it. You can't call these people privileged. They're not.
Well, yes, of course. But let me say a couple of things. One is, I mean, Lacerdo actually doesn't have a developed theory of labor aristocracy on the one hand. On the other hand, Lacerdo's work is kind of like it's like a huge sea. It's not an ocean. Right? He's not Marx, but it's a kind of mini sea, and there's a lot. He's written a lot, and very little of Lacerdo is prescriptive, and very little is praxis. We call praxis based. Rockhill has also little praxis, and I don't really read Rockhill. I read Rockhill more charitably, much more charitably than you do.
But when he says something like that, you got to take notice. You got to listen.
What he said about it, though, on my program, you may have heard it, is in reference, and I slightly agree with him here, to a theory of petty bourgeois radicalism. He was referring to it. He wasn't, as far as I know, making a blanketing statement about the working class as such. So, although some thinkers, including one of my mentors, Alain Badiou, kind of does make a claim about the work,
this is what they concluded from their generational experience.
Right. Which is very tied into this kind of 68 moment and
it
a break.
Forecloses the future, though. We're way past that. We're going into post neoliberalism now. Like we can't live under the shadow of these kinds of conclusions. Now, look, labor aristocracy, whatever. Look, I'm going to tell you, of course, I don't think that the labor movement that exists in the United States the organized labor. Sure, of course they're a prop of imperialism. Absolutely. Of course they are. They absolutely are. Now, a defensive posture with respect, right, to them, meaning, should they be defended against the onslaught of neoliberalism? Well, neoliberalism is over. It's not looking exactly the same way that it did for most of my lifetime. Meaning now the Republicans are going to seek some labor union support. And, I just feel like, okay, these organizations exist, but they're not fit for purpose. They're not
Yeah.
really class struggle organizations.
Right.
Just at the level of basic, like liberal, like collective bargaining.
Hmm.
Like just that, they're not even fit for that,
Hmm.
let alone to be the basis for a socialist movement.
No, I
So
completely agree.
of
Right.
course, like I'm not going to deny that there's a labor bureaucracy. I think that's really the term rather than labor aristocracy.
Hmm.
And that is politically compromised and is part of the Bonapartist capitalist state, is part of the bracket system of the parties, and is therefore part of imperialism. Of course it is.
Yeah. Right. I think that's a helpful point of clarity. Although it raises a question I wanted to pose to you regarding, and this is really something that I need more clarity on. You at times seem to have almost a type of realist embrace of the American executive,
Mm,
um,
mm.
in such a way which almost reads to me, Chris, as almost like uncritical of it, or even almost as some sort of like teleological force of history. So, for example, your recent article in Compact on Trump in Greenland.
Came out just today, yeah. Mhm.
So, can you defend that or clarify that view that you hold there? Because, is this an example of a type of Cutrone provocative?
Oh, well, obviously.
Okay, it's not so obvious. Why don't you say more?
Yeah, I mean, uh, I will say about the compact editors, they do shave off the quirkiness, and so they iron out the humor. I had an X-Files reference in there that they took out, right? There's something surrealist about the Trump Greenland thing. So now, okay, so let's back up a second. A few things. There is an imperial presidency. It has a very ambivalent, contradictory history because a dialectical approach to not only Bonapartism but to imperialism itself is called for from a Marxist point of view. Meaning, were the Confederates right that Abraham Lincoln was like a military dictator and it's a war of northern aggression against the South in the refounding of the United States as a centralized state, right? Of course they were right about that. But that doesn't mean you support the Confederacy. Which, by the way, Tariq Ali, old editor of New Left Review and of Verso Books, said we should regret the victory of the Union because if the Confederates had won, it would have prevented the rise of US imperialism. Okay. No. No. In other words, the victory of the Union was a victory for capitalism. It was the creation of a Bonapartist state that was already in the making since Andrew Jackson, but really cemented it and created the imperial presidency. Now, the issue is there is this imperial presidency, there's an executive branch, but it has since become the deep state. It has since become the Bonapartist state in the sense of a permanent, non elected bureaucracy, special bodies of armed men, and special bodies of men who have behind them special bodies of armed men. And what we're dealing with now in our era is whether there is any even semblance of elected civilian control over that. And that's where, Spencer Leonard and I went to see the movie Vice about Dick Cheney. And we came out of it just shaking our damn heads saying, this is the version of history that the millennials are going to accept. and we thought it was wrong, meaning the unitary executive theory of the Nixonites pushing back against the post-Watergate reforms. They had a point, which is that this is going to eliminate elected civilian control. It's going to undermine the presidency in favor of the bureaucracy. And Trump, of course, has run afoul of the deep state. Now, whether it's because he's just a buffoon, it doesn't matter. He's the only elected one. The deep state's not. He is. And so you have to side with that. You have to side with the elected person. It's like Biden. I think there's reason to believe that Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan was sabotaged by the deep state. I think it was turned into a fiasco. I think that he faced a lot of resistance against that withdrawal, and they were like, oh, so you want to pull out? Well, fuck you. We'll make it as horrible as possible and as much egg on your face as we possibly can. That's what we're dealing with. So it's not about defending the Bonapartist state as some kind of telos of history by any means. It's about upholding the contradiction, because we're living in a contradiction. The contradiction is liberal democracy versus the capitalist state. And it erupts every now and then. And it takes perverse forms.
Mm-hmm.
Trump versus the deep state.
Mm-hmm. So my view on Bonapartism is slightly different than yours, I think, because for me, I see Bonapartism as the solution that the bourgeoisie summons forth
Mm-hmm.
when the masses learn about democracy or practice democracy,
Right.
or when the class struggle becomes so ripe. Bonapartism emerges as a kind of compromise, and it takes three forms, actually: soft, hard, or Caesarism. Yeah? And I'm really, really leaning on Gramsci's kind of
Yeah, I
schema.
was going to say that's Gramsci.
It's very Gramscian, but I think he's right? So in other words, FDR is a classic soft Bonapartist. Trump would be kind of a hard Bonapartist, but not a Caesarist. But a Caesarist would be when the deep state and the Bonapartist figure almost fuse into one,
Yeah.
and they permit him to be, or her to be, fully dictatorial. That's when you get fascism. I think that's a useful framework. In part, then, therefore, and the Bolsheviks had to deal with Bonapartism in such an interesting way because they telegraphed the possibility of them becoming socialist Bonapartist figures. And they tried to invent solutions to mitigate it, right? And one of the things I think with the history of Leninism that's very interesting for our time, I think, is sort of how do we concoct a kind of socialist demilitarized, like Leninism in some sense doesn't work unless you have an armed proletariat, in some sense. And I think that one of the interesting things I've been thinking about a lot is this question of violence, state violence, and a proletarian organization through parliamentary means, but also extra parliamentary means, and what that actually looks like. And that is why I think practically where I land today is mostly in the neo-Kautskyite cosmonaut position, although I'm losing my fidelity to it because it's absolutely reliant on the DSA. I'm losing my fidelity and my belief in it precisely because I don't see the DSA as capable of enacting the type, like Derek Varn recently said, there's more former DSA members than there are current DSA members, right? So, Donald and that whole tendency, while I think theoretically and practically it's very sound, I'm a bit adrift right now. I'm a bit adrift. I don't know strategically where to go. Okay. I'll be honest. At least I'm being honest, right?
Yeah.
And right. So anyway, so Bonapartism for me is nothing to be. I mean, look at Sanders. You have this concept of millennial left.
Right.
One of the dangers was that the demoralization and the puncturing, grill pilling, the puncturing of enthusiasm revolves around the fact that we put all of our cards into the executive branch theory in some sense, or into this idea of a kind of presidential takeover. And we saw what happened. It was actually quite easy to kneecap him. Right? So I want to encourage socialists not to put all of our eggs in one basket, right? And I feel that your embrace of of it is sort of curious to me, because I
No,
know
no, it's
you
not an embrace. I mean, look, let's be careful about this. Um, I met a lot of like working class and people of color Bernie supporters who were very upfront, and many of them were veterans of the War on Terror, in fact. And because this was around the time that I started my campaign for a socialist party, and they said, if not Bernie, then Trump. And I was a little bit taken aback. I was like, how does that work? Right. And it's because the war was such the issue for them. And they did, see Trump as the anti-war candidate as they saw Bernie. Now,
working
Bernie.
in other words, working class people tend to be oppositional to the status quo.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
It's the fact. Yeah.
absolutely. And so, now I never was a fan of Bernie, but um, a couple of things about Bernie. One is he said it would take a movement, and he couldn't do it alone. It would take a movement, and he meant it in a way that Obama didn't when Obama said the same thing. Now, in the American political party system, being elected president does give you control over the party. But Bernie never intended to be president because he knew that he would never be allowed to be the nominee by the Democrats. So he was always a message candidate. And then the question was, how far can he take his message candidacy? But he knew they would never let him be the candidate. And so there never was this prospect, the way Trump took over the Republican Party, of Bernie taking over the Democrats.
It took us a while. It took us a while to see that, right?
But that it was obvious from the beginning. And, I do want to
Well, it was
say,
obvious to people that are more
older.
experienced.
I'm just
Yeah.
older. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I just kind of wish, like, come on. But anyway,
I totally agree with you on this point. Okay.
And so, now Bernie did what he could, and Adolf Reed got behind Bernie, but then was very anxious that the enthusiasm around Bernie wouldn't translate into votes for Hillary. And so he wrote an article. Adolf wrote an article. You have to vote for the corrupt warmonger candidate. It's important, namely Hillary, right, against Trump, because he's like, no, because Trump will just mean the end of everything. And he actually told Platypus members, you know, Chris is leading you into a concentration camp. And I said, he's lying. Like, in other words, he doesn't believe that. So why did he say that? And this is what I mean when I said the left is dead, and the only role that they play is to miseducate, because he really didn't want people to not vote for Hillary. And and he thought Chris Cutrone saying why not Trump is somehow gonna, like, it's like magical thinking or something. We're back to psychology. It's like, no, there's a good chance Trump's gonna be elected and we shouldn't lose our shit over it. And do we really prefer Hillary? Really? Like, again, and being a public intellectual, tricky business. It's a tricky business. Because, of course, I have my theoretical perspective, I have my sense of reality, and I have to engage in rhetoric also. And what is my goal as a public intellectual? To make people think. Not to tell them how to think, but to provoke their thinking. Like, why would a Marxist get behind Trump acquiring Greenland? Think about that for a second.
Yeah, tell us why.
Why not? So unfortunately, they didn't use my title. My title was Why Not Greenland? Why not?
The WWF president, right?
But seriously, like, why not? And, maybe that would be the actual decolonization of Greenland if it became part of the United States.
Oh,
Because
Jesus.
certainly, as a territory of the Kingdom of Denmark, come on. Right? And
Yeah.
the Inuit can get together. The Alaskan and Greenland Inuits can get together and be a constituency.
Right. Well, I feel like it's an example of a kind of distraction politics, a type of spectacle, which is
Oh, Trump? No, he really means it. He really means it. He
Think
wants
so?
it for strategic reasons. Of course, he wants it for military reasons and rare earth minerals and whatever else. Of course, he means it. Yeah, he means it. It's not a distraction. No, he means it. And he probably means it about Panama too, which is far more dicey. I mean,
That is far more dicey. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
lived in the time when the U.S. did invade Panama to get rid of
Yep.
Noriega.
Right.
And so now, so what is it all about, right? And how do we understand the geopolitical moment? And as I wrote in my article, maybe Trump is serious about dismantling NATO in the end. Maybe he's like, we need Greenland because we're abandoning Europe.
Highly doubtful.
Highly doubtful.
Highly
But
doubtful.
that that's what people are thinking and what they're saying.
Right.
And it's also a pressure tactic, which he's like, you know what? Yeah, Greenland already belongs to NATO, but maybe we don't trust that. It's a signal.
Yeah. I
And
see.
this is
Yeah.
that's all capitalist politics. The point of the matter is that socialists really have no position on it. But if you're going to scream US imperialism, let's remember that the US still is different from Europe. And what makes it different? It is different. And certainly my generational experience was that the left always upheld Europe against the United States.
Mm.
And I think that's wrong. Upheld Canada against the United States, and I think that's wrong.
I think where we would probably disagree, I mean, I was just speaking to a comrade recently about the positive impact of Domenico Lacerda in the global South for millennial Marxists. So not American Marxists, but kind of people my age or younger who read Lacerda. And he said something very interesting, which is that the thinkers that are drawn to Lacerda tend to be more proletarian on the one hand, barred from university opportunities on the other hand. And what Lacerda permits them to think, and I admire this, despite any criticisms I may have about Lacerda, is to move beyond the taboo of we are empowered to think about and to be interested in taking power. In other words, that old Foucauldian legacy, right?
Right.
Which is a Nietzschean legacy ultimately, because when Nietzsche enters the left, and maybe this is a way for us to make a bridge to Nietzsche, one of the effects I've seen, Chris, is that actually you sort of throw your hands up in the face of power. There's a sort of there's an asceticism, a saintliness that kind of imbues the left-wing mindset some way. And so this comrade was saying that in his case, in Brazil, a lot of acolytes of Lacerda are sort of creating movements that are critical of existing left academics and more interested in things like socialism should be about seizing the means of production, putting aside whatever how we do that, but like at least sort of in principle or in theory, right? And who amongst the kind of 68 left of the great philosophers and so on, Deleuze,
they're rejecting the neoliberal left, and
they're rejecting the neoliberal left, and Lacerda's giving them tools to do that, which you refer to as neo-Stalinism, right? And we will get to that.
It is.
Okay, we will get to that. But let us, if we
could. Are those
could.
the only two choices?
No, those are not the only two choices.
I hope not. I mean, God help us.
Let's get to that. I want to kind of wrap up our conversation with a consideration of your understanding of both Stalinism as well as its current appearance as you see it. But first, let's make a kind of pivot back to Friedrich Nietzsche. I find Lukacs and his analysis more primary than Lacerda's analysis of Nietzsche for my own thinking on this. And I do read Nietzsche, by the way. That's the whole idea of parasite is he's a symptomatic thinker. Yeah, he's a symptomatic thinker. And I read his presence as a pugilistic presence. Like, in other words, I read Nietzsche as a profound enemy to working class emancipation, to proletarian emancipation. And I find his thought highly political, dripping with politics, what he calls great politics. So much so that you actually have to read Nietzsche to find, because he houses it within aesthetics in an interesting way. So you have to glean all of that. And I find that the Walter Kaufmann legacy tries to sort of whitewash all of that and remove that radicalism of Nietzsche, which is not a radicalism that's somehow symmetrical with no, it's a radicalism very divergent from the objectives of the left. So ultimately Nietzsche is a critic of the left, but a left of the broader egalitarian revolutionary tradition.
So was Marx.
So was Marx. So was Marx. So was Marx. Yes, I get into this as well in my work. Okay, but when we get into the weeds of and that's what's needed actually, is a true dialogue between Marx and Nietzsche. Like those 20th century Marxist philosophers like Adorno and Paul Ricoeur, the Hermeneutics of Suspicion, they were right that Marx and Nietzsche remain.
Well, I would definitely argue against the hermeneutics of suspicion, because I don't think that Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud are good to make us suspicious. I think that they're critical thinkers, not suspicious thinkers, and that's another difference. So let's back it up a second. So, great politics. Okay, so Kaufmann was writing in a different moment, of course. So Kaufmann was writing after basically the defeat of Germany in World War I and World War II. So, the question is, would Nietzsche have supported either Wilhelmine, Prussianism, or Nazism? No, of course he would not. And he was very much against Bismarck in his own time. At the same time, he was against or critical of a kind of unreflective liberalism of his time, even while he wrestled with it. He talks about the English psychologists, and Herbert Spencer and these kinds of figures, right? And he's very keen to the perverse outcomes of history, but is also arguing against a kind of right Hegelianism that simply affirms the unfolding of history as somehow the expression of necessity. So Nietzsche, to me, is a symptomatic thinker. He's not an apologist. He's not an affirmer of his status quo by any means. And he's expressing the discontents with that. Now, he adopts various masks for that, but he's not actually an aristocrat. And he is turning the kind of natural aristocracy, meritocracy idea of bourgeois society and of liberalism against itself, and trying to demonstrate its kind of hidden motives, if you will. The slave revolt in morality, meaning the ultimate triumph of the slave revolt in morality is bourgeois society itself, is liberalism. It's the ultimate fruition of that. And yet it claims to be something else. It claims to be moral progress. So there's so much going on in Nietzsche that I just feel that, the value of Nietzsche is literary. Is it philosophical? It depends on what one means by philosophy. It's not like he offers a philosophical system. I mean, I think I always encounter this, especially when people are arguing about like Hegel and Marx and this kind of thing. I feel like the value of philosophers per se, and I don't think that Marx is a philosopher, is to make you think something that's not on the page. And in that way, Nietzsche is a valuable philosopher because of what he makes you think that isn't written right there.
Okay.
And he instructs you in how to read that way.
Right.
And very deliberately so.
Mm-hmm.
To invoke a Kaufmanism, The problem with Nietzsche is that he's too good a writer.
Yes, I agree with that. I totally agree with that.
Right?
So look, I think that Nietzsche's
He's not a
politics.
socialist. He's not a leftist. He thinks that the left and socialism are just liberalism, and he's right because mostly it is.
Yeah. Okay. So my understanding and my interpretation of Nietzsche's politics is that it is primarily a politics which is concerned with the legacies of this kind of egalitarian thread of Christianity. So it's important to differentiate in all things Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity as itself imbued, as sort of dripping with the egalitarian movements that have a prehistory in the genealogical method, in starting really with Socrates, in this kind of dialectical plebeian form of thought, which Nietzsche sees as triumphant within certain elements of socialism, for sure. But I would say, actually, there's been and Loserdo and Lukacs have helped me to see this. There is a tendency on behalf of Marxists to say, oh, well, if Nietzsche would have known about Marx, he could have gotten behind communism.
Oh, no. I don't think that at all. I think that it's really
There's many contemporary Deleuzians that do think that, and then they use that to incorporate Nietzsche as the primary philosopher of the left. And that is what I'm very critical of.
No, that's of course, and that's to my mind a very traditional notion of philosophy, meaning they turn Nietzsche into some kind of actual materialist.
Right.
And Heidegger too.
Absolutely.
And so they think, well, you need like a real materialist ontology as an underpinning for Marxism, and Nietzsche and Heidegger are going to provide it.
That's what I reject. Yeah,
I totally disagree, and I think that's wrongheaded completely. No, it's funny, right? And that's postmodernism.
Exactly.
So postmodernism inherits from Stalinism this undialectical and anti-dialectical anti-metaphysic and anti-idealism, rather than being able to take up the metaphysics of appearance, the is-ought distinction, right? Which again I mentioned earlier, the descriptive versus the normative versus the critical.
Right.
The is-ought distinction, that because something is doesn't mean it ought to be.
Right, of course.
And also the way things are going is not necessarily the true potential.
Right.
Reading history against the grain. And it's the last man versus the overman.
Well, I mean, I think that Nietzsche's politics actually contain a sort of meditation on suffering, a theodicy, a kind of like what is the meaning of Nietzsche wanting to politicize the wisdom of the Greeks, right? And I would actually say that is put into the service of a reinvented bourgeois, this is Lukacs' view as well, a reinvention of bourgeois militancy for a possible direction. And this is why Nietzsche, right after he died, we had these things with Stefan George in Germany of the Nietzsche cults, the Nietzsche cults, which had the effect, Chris, of effectively, and this is one of the things Nietzsche does, it's kind of creating third wayism, kind of like collapsing the left-right distinction and sort of putting forward this sort of politics as a sort of subtraction from, so it is definitely anti-bourgeois politics. It's definitely anti-mainstream, anti-liberal, and all of that. What I worry about, though, in this Nietzschean sort of cultish form of thinking politics is there's certain elements of Nietzsche's critique that cannot be expunged or transcended, even if one is sort of committed to the broad principles of the left, such as Nietzsche's views on the revolutionary tradition, say Jacobinism, are so thoroughly antagonistic that what ends up happening to the left is you have a kind of anti-egalitarian left. And that is what I'm critical of. Which, in other words, Marx and Engels, as you know, as a student of the history of them as political actors, are always in a dance with the unmet demands of the French Revolution, freedom,
Sure.
equality,
Sure.
liberty, and so on.
Sure.
Nietzscheanism, I think, wants to have a total abolishment and a total abolition of all of those as sort of like fake idols, right?
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is this sort of like radical asceticism, which paradoxically does go to reinforce the bourgeois status quo.
It can.
On the one hand, on the other hand, one of the effects of Nietzscheanism that I track is that there is embedded the invention of an intellectual cadre, which has a fundamental hostility to the development of working class intellectual life. And that precisely because Nietzsche actually wrote a lot throughout the entirety of his work against plebeian, what he called philosopher journalists, right? So you end up, you end up, Chris, with a kind of elitism that goes disavowed. Okay. Now, what I'm where I differ from other Marxist critics of Nietzsche that read Lukacs and Lacerda is that I am of the mind that we must not censor Nietzsche or abandon Nietzsche as a proto-fascist, but that actually we must read him as a symptomatic figure and glean all of this, glean it out.
Right. I mean,
So
what I'd say is, Socrates, of course, was not a plebeian figure. So there's an interesting way that, Socrates is taken up as a kind of plebeian figure, and this is where Nietzsche's critique would come in, which is to say, all these values taken up by the plebeian or the slave revolt are actually values of the aristocracy. Turn the other cheek, love your enemy, right? That these are actually had Rome become Christianized through its ruling class, that's who was converted to Christianity, and he thinks that there's something authentic about that that's denied, and that the church pretends to be something else. The church pretends to be on the side of the poor, but really it's engaged in a conversion of the aristocracy. And it's a kind of never-ending task, and that Protestantism, because he's very bitter about Protestantism, we have to be clear about that. He upholds Catholicism against Protestantism. That Protestantism pretends that it isn't about converting the aristocracy, but it's about the people, and that's the lie.
I hear you, and I think that is. I don't necessarily disagree. Here's the problem that I have, though. Let's take as Deleuze says, Nietzsche's value to philosophy is he's one of the greatest inventors of concepts, and so everything is gauged on the because Nietzsche was a journalist as well as Marx was, so they both were good at public relations and philosophy, right? So this notion of most all of Nietzsche's concepts were already in the air. He just he just really branded them well. You know, the eternal return of the same. Ressentiment. Kierkegaard talked about ressentiment. People prior, Dostoevsky. But ressentiment. Okay, let's think about that for a second. Nietzsche's total critique on the philosophers of ressentiment expunge interlocutors who the political Marx, the young Marx, found absolutely formative.
Oh, of course.
Right?
The young Hegelians.
Rousseau.
And Rousseau. Well, sure.
Rousseau. I mean, Rousseau is a moral spider who Nietzsche says the overman will dance on the cave of Rousseau as a resentful philosophy when we are triumphant in the future, in Zarathustra. And so there is a sense in which, if our tradition is opened by the French Revolution, I think that Nietzsche stands in a weird way, almost as like, and you could call it kind of a negative Socratic function, as a great antagonist to that tradition, right? And so,
do you know what Adorno said about this? And this is a conversation he had with other members of the Frankfurt School during World War II. It was published in Constellations, I think. He said, until Marx is proven right, Nietzsche will remain valid.
Right.
And I think that that's a good, in other words, that doesn't mean Nietzsche's right. It doesn't. It means he's valid, meaning he's describing something that's true.
Right. Well, that's why I say we live in Nietzsche's world. And I feel that Nietzsche is a philosophy, especially after the collapse of the USSR, I fully agree with Jeff Waite here, that is more the common sense of our.
By the way, his son was an early member of Platypus. Ben
Oh,
Waite.
really?
Yep.
I'm hoping to do an event with him soon because his book is a wonderful examination. He's a kind of, he calls himself a Straussian Maoist.
Sure. No, exactly. No, I know the backstory to the whole thing. So no, indeed. So I would just say, again, I think that, look, we're living in fearful times, and people who are afraid don't want to think. How can they? I might be asking too much of people. Give yourself the freedom to think. Don't be blackmailed into being afraid to think. I mean, I'll end on something because the big controversy, especially reanimated in the past year and a half now, has been Israel-Palestine, and that was at the core of the boycott letter and everything else. I mentioned this to Doug Lane in a recent podcast with him in a recent Cutrone Zone. I was shocked to see, to confront Zizek. And I do feel like you, Daniel, and maybe the turn to reading Lasordo and Gabriel Rockhill has to do with this disenchantment with Zizek, who was a teacher of the millennial left. I saw a clip of his where he starts off by saying, well, I agree that Hamas must be destroyed. And I was like, man, what are you talking about? And then he was like, but what Israel is doing, goes way beyond blah, 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 like anything that's justifiable. And, and I told Doug this, that's not my perspective, right? And Bernie said something similar. That Bernie also, as like a figure for the millennial left, Bernie said something very similar. Well, of course, Hamas must be destroyed. And I was like, no, right? Like, in other words, that's not my perspective at all. And what I did was, after October 7th, I simply said, well, Hamas is going to be destroyed, and we have to deal with that reality. That doesn't mean it must be. So again, the normative is descriptive. Right.
The Izot, yep.
Right. And I just thought, man, what is up with these people? And it's because, Zizek was the one. Don't fall for the double blackmail. It was around the Yugoslav war. It was for the premillennial leftism. Don't fall for the double blackmail. And I'm like, but he is falling for it. And maybe it's too much to ask that we not.
I slightly disagree, only insofar as the history of Hamas, right? Israel also relies on Hamas.
Oh, of course they do.
Do they want Hamas to be gone? They don't want Hamas to be gone.
No, I know. They rely on each other. Zionism and first Arab nationalism and now Islamism. And they do, I know it's an evil collusion that's at work there. And I agree. And so therefore I cannot, my position is not the left should support the destruction of Hamas. No, not at all. And, in other words, I can see, even though I see Sinwar, as like a gangster, and I can respect nonetheless. This is a warrior who chose his strategy, who chose his war, and who went down fighting. I can respect the dignity of that. At the same time that I can say that's not the way forward for socialism.
So why don't we conclude with this question about Stalinism? Spencer Leonard is someone who, has continuously referred to me as this, and it sort of like throws me off. He calls me a Stalinist. I'm like, this is part of my problem here, in the sense that,
like, Lasordo was a Stalinist.
Okay, well, sure, but like this idea of
and by the way, they should have just published the Stalin book. Like, the idea that you're only going to publish some things and not other things, that they didn't publish Western Marxism because of the takedown of Perry Anderson, and they're not going to publish the Stalin book. It's like, you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. It's the same argument. If you're going to publish the liberalism book, you have to publish the Stalin book, and you have to publish the Western Marxism book.
Well, I mean, you've been talking a lot about the Izot distinction, and I just feel that the ethics of public intellectual discourse should be that an accusation, like, because you called me a neo-Stalinist breaking from Zizek, and then you put me into the camp with Hazaldin. And you
Yeah,
saw
you
my
and House
recent.
are a little different. There is a difference, of course. There's a
Okay,
difference.
so let me stop now and turn it over to you and help us understand your sort of
My
wider theory of
perspective on
Stalinism.
Stalinism.
Please go ahead.
So, first of all, I would say Stalinism isn't anything. Meaning there is no thing, Stalinism. Stalinism it takes a myriad of forms. It's as facile as Trotskyism, meaning there are many tendencies deadly opposed to each other. There was the Sino-Soviet split. There was the China-Vietnamese War. There was the Vietnamese invasion of Kampuchea to put down the Khmer Rouge. Stalinism doesn't exist. Stalinism isn't a thing. So what is it? It's the liquidation of Marxism. And it's the self-liquidation of Marxism. It is opportunism. To go back to Kolakowski, it is the right. Meaning, when he was saying the concept of the left, he was saying, what does it mean that we're living under a communist, nominally Marxist regime that is actually the right? Because it is, and it was, and it remains. The alternative is to say, no, the struggle continues. And now we have socialist construction. And the problem with ending with Marx and Lenin and Trotsky and the Frankfurt School is that it leaves you pessimistic. It cuts you off from the real living history of socialism, which is socialist construction in the Soviet Union and China. And not just with Mao, because the Maoists consider China after Mao, the actual Maoists consider China after Mao to be a fascist state. Guess what? They're right about that. But of course, they're also wrong about that. Now, you have to follow through with Deng Xiaoping, and now with Xi Jinping. You have to follow. And you have to worship the status quo, is what Trotsky called it. No, I think that Stalinism is what happened to Marxism when it had to reconcile itself to the continuation of capitalism. And that's not a national thing, that's a world historical thing. So whatever had to be done in these countries, Horkheimer and Adorno said, millions of peasants are dying in China in the Great Leap Forward, and maybe after that, no one will starve anymore. Right? Meaning, like, it's a horror. And they said, this is due to imperialism. That's why all the peasants are starving in China. It's due to imperialism. But also the Stalinists, Mao was complicit. Meaning he did what was necessary in a country that had to deal with the world reality of imperialism. You can't heroize that. It's 2025. You can't say this is good. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. The point is, Russia and China should never have had to have undergone a brutal industrialization process. They did. What's done is done. But they should never have had to. And the fact that they had to is due to imperialism. It is. But that doesn't mean that it's a heroic struggle for socialism. That's not what that means. So Stalinism isn't a thing, it's a rationalization for what had to be done under conditions of unfreedom. You can't call that socialism. That's what it boils down to. And it, again, sentimentality, morality, psychology can't get in the way of the fact that this should not have been necessary. Socialism achieved in Europe and the United States would have made it possible to develop Russia and China without millions of peasants dying.
Right. Yeah.
That was a possibility. It was a possibility. We can't let go of that, and we can't say, oh, well, no, it's the labor aristocracy, it's imperialism. No. And where does that leave us now in 2025? It's like the 1619 Project. Is the United States the product of genocide and slavery?
In part.
Whoa, but that's not a dialectical view. In other words, in part. In other words, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that it's the product of labor, including the labor of those who were genocided and enslaved. In other words, the United States is not just the ill-gotten gains of oppression and exploitation. It is the heritage that the working class must take over and move to socialism.
So all of that,
We have
okay,
to honor the sacrifice of the past,
right.
not be transfixed by it, and
Mhm,
also not be misled by it. We can't say Xi Jinping is socialism.
mhm.
Total abdication of what we have to do.
Okay, so let me now respond. My position on all of this is slightly moderated in recent times, precisely in the sense that I don't think that it is wise to say that contemporary China and Stalin are unblemished, like some kind of pure expressions of socialism, which we must have
It's not about
fidelity to.
purity. It's about, is it the path forward?
Well, there's a danger here in the sense that purity does become a kind of operative category to analyze our
I want to
proximity
honor the
to.
sacrifice.
Well, I also want to see existing projects of state socialism in the historical materialist arc of a connectivity to the process of their modernization.
Has it made the US more socialist, or has it made China more capitalist? Communist China.
Socialism with Chinese characteristics may be the future of the planet.
It's
We
not
don't
going to
know.
be.
We don't know that yet.
I'm
We
pretty
don't know
sure,
that yet.
Daniel. I'm pretty sure that China's heading towards a collapse like the Soviet Union. And the
But that
reason
is
for that,
that is what every liberal pundit is also saying.
no, but the reason for that, the reason it is odd thing, it's the descriptive. They don't have the political resiliency. They don't have the ability to really deal with a crisis. And there's a whole bureaucracy there. There's a whole Chinese Communist Party cadre there that's ready to say, you know what, we're capitalists.
Okay, so one of the things that I worry about here, and I think that, the idea of
I have them. I have their children are my students.
well, the idea of viewing existing socialist states from, as far flung and as heterogeneous as Cuba, Venezuela, China,
They're different. Yeah.
as fully fascist capitalist projects, as opposed to what I would prefer to read them through the lens of, as sort of like compromised and impure
prefer to too.
experimentations in the development of socialism, right?
We have to make it so.
Where Marxist-Leninist ideology was instrumentalized in brutalist ways that reinforced a kind of upside down world in the Hegelian sense, right? Like literally took a 180 of the intended purport of Marxist practice and perverted it. Of course, Stalinism is a perversion of Marxism. At the same time, of course, these projects of Mao and Stalin achieved these egalitarian advancements and class abolition achievements. The abolition of the peasantry, the achievement of the abolition of the peasantry, and the lifting literacy rates and so on. All of that needs to be seen.
Nobody denies that.
Well, part of the problem here is that when we don't recognize the kernel of something emancipatory that took place here historically, that's what I worry.
Will tell you there are good and bad parts of the Chinese Revolution.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But when Adorno was asked, when Adorno was asked about it, he was happy to see nothing of an emancipatory kernel that can be tarried with. I think that the building of socialism needs to tarry with elements within.
And that was during the Cultural Revolution. And that
Sorry?
was during the Cultural Revolution that Adorno said that. which I
kind of
think is
strange.
important.
Well, I mean, it's kind of a strange moment to say that, in my opinion, but whatever.
A lot of leftists at the time were misled by the Cultural Revolution
Right.
into thinking that it was some revolution within the revolution, some democratization, some class struggle within China. It wasn't.
So you've explained Stalinism, and I think in general, I generally agree, although we differ in our analysis of how contemporary socialists in the States, in the core regions, should relate to existing socialist
I
parties.
don't think we should adopt a Maoist strategy for the United States. It's as simple as that. And by the way, Mao himself also told the Maoists who went to visit him, "I can't help you, comrades. You have to find your own way."
Well,
It's
I never signed up for that, and I'm not suggesting that we do that either. What I'm now wondering about is how your theory of neo-Stalinism and the break from the Zizekian left, what does that look like?
I think it's desperate. In other words, I do think it's just rad libism. It's what it's always been. Meaning, if you look at the 70s Maoists that came out of the SDS, if you look at Revolutionary Youth Movement 1 and Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, and you look at the Weathermen, and they all thought of themselves as very Marxist. They were not. And they were very desperate, and they did look forward to things like race war. And it's bad stuff. Like, Bernardine Dorn celebrated the Manson murders. It's
Yeah,
bad.
but I'm not anywhere near that.
I know that that's
I'm not
all
in
like
this Luigi
sounds.
Mangione. I mean, I agree with Lenin's criticism of terrorism as a tactic.
But that's
has
where it's
no
going. At
it
a
has no
psychological
place.
level, at a moral level, at an outrage level, at a sentimental
Socialists need
level.
to move against that. We need to create the mechanisms.
We have to have an alternative to it. In other words, we can't like oppose it, because then we're just going to be on the side of the state.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? But we have to create an alternative to it. And by the way, that's going to be hard work. And, and I've had to consider the fact that, because I've been a bête noire with the millennial left, and maybe now with the Zoomer left, I wish that I could go under a different identity in terms of my campaign for a socialist party, because I don't want to be a liability. At the same time, I also think anyone who's willing to think will find my intentions have been good.
Yeah, I'm happy that I had you on this show. I mean, I'm happy that we started this dialogue. I just want to reiterate what I said at the beginning, which I think that our differences remain pretty clear. Our points of commonality around, we both are of the mind that something needs to transpire, right? At the level of a kind of broad civil society based engagement for the construction of a socialist party. I mean, you are doing this campaign for a socialist party, which is a pre-political work.
Pre-political, yeah.
It's pre-political, right? And
Talk
I
about
think
experimentation. It's experimental.
It's experimental. And I think that you're right to attempt to seriously separate the sort of project of Platypus and its negative dialectics from that, right?
Yes.
How else could you, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Right? A project, it has to have reliance consensus building, and there's a kind of interpersonal trust.
Yeah, it can't be based on ideological struggle, because that's just it creates more differences than are warranted. I mean, they're just not warranted at this point. I mean, like I said, look, me and Gerald Horne could be part of the same Socialist Party project, and he could call me a white settler colonialist Marxist, and I could call him a black nationalist, and we could smile at each other, shake hands, and cooperate.
Well, I'd like to create a public sphere that would allow that to happen, right? But I'm not sure. I'm not sure that our current one would allow that to happen. So, we have to kind of walk on eggshells.
The left is still dead.
I don't want to walk on eggshells anymore.
Right.
Like, our differences are real.
Right.
I don't think you've convinced me that I'm a neo-Stalinist because I reject Zizek's sort of like, Zizek's a Democrat, man. I mean, let's be honest. And that's why I reject him. I mean, politically speaking, I think all kinds of wonderful insights can happen regarding psychoanalysis and all of that.
I had a professor at Hampshire College, Joan Bratterman, video artist. And Hampshire College, very lefty type place. And she said, "Isn't it annoying when you're seen as a liberal when you're really a radical?" And my response was, because she's not a Marxist, she's not a socialist. I was like, "But what's the difference?"
Yes, but I profess Marxism, and that's the difference, right? Well,
You got to live up to it then.
I'm doing the best I
And
can.
that's what I'm here to, be the gadfly on. Talk about Socrates.
It's a mutual inquisition. It goes both ways. It goes both ways. I think
No,
we'll close.
I
Yeah.
appreciate, Daniel, that you've given me the opportunity to at least try to explain myself. I hope that I've done a decent job.
Well, maybe perhaps one productive venue, Chris, would be for this to turn into writing, and I would be more than happy to express some of my thoughts in writing. So perhaps that might be a natural direction for us in the event, because we didn't even talk about Lukacs and
Right.
his.
There's other things to get into. And
There are other things to get into. We didn't talk about the Frankfurt School. We
not
didn't
very
talk
much.
about Adorno's Leninism. We didn't talk about Lenin's liberalism and all of your.
Well, people can read that. So my
Right.
book from last year, Marxism and Politics,
Mhm.
750-page companion volume to my 250-page Death of the Millennial Left. You can actually read what I think about these
Yep.
things,
Yep.
about Marx, Lenin, and Adorno,
Yep.
and Benjamin, and there's even a little Nietzsche in there.
Yep.
If I can be allowed that.
Oh, no. You see, there you have misunderstood me, because I am not gatekeeping Nietzsche here. Okay, but I'm glad we hopefully cleared that up. But all right, comrades, we'll close now, and perhaps to be continued. Thank you for everybody for listening. All the best, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.